floss tube. Rachel here at Mainly Cross Stitch. You can find me at mainly_xstitch on Instagram and my website at mainlyxstitch.com. I am here with a floss tube extra for you today. My plan is to cover over 2 stitching. So when you use a higher fabric count to essentially equal a lower fabric count. So for example, and I'll kind of just put this on the screen here, I'm going to write it. So for example, you have your typical like 11 count Aida, 14 count Aida is also really popular, so is 16 count and 18 count. Some lesser known counts can be 20 and 22. Those are really the upper end of what you can get with Aida, right? So an Aida is pretty simple to work with. You have just your regular box with your holes, and it's very easy to tell where you need to cross. So that's Aida. Typically, 1 or 2 strands for 18 count, and then 2 strands for lower. 11 count, people tend to use 3 strands. There is 9 count, like for perforated, not perforated, but plastic canvas and stuff, for which I think probably even 4 strands you would, but I don't work with these. For 20 and 22 count, you do just 1 strand. So if we kind of follow this guideline, when we take a look at our Evenweave fabrics and like our linens, lugana is a, I can't spell, lugana is a type of Evenweave. Typically lugana is a blend of fibers, depending on where you get it from. Linen is all flax, typically. So if we take a look at the sizing, linens and Evenweaves are typically in the higher number counts. So you'll see usually 25 will be the lowest. And 25 count lugana is actually the standard for Heaven and Earth designs. So when they do their patterns, they calculate it using this size, stitching over 1 for Hades. Okay, you can stitch over 2 on a lugana. That's 25 count. In order to figure out what that would be overall, you just divide this by 2. And I'll show you what stitching over 2 on 25 count looks like. This is an FF. It's an FO, just a finished object, because I haven't framed it. This was stitched over 2 fabric threads on 25 count white lugana. So this is a blend of polyester and cotton. And let's see if we can get the camera to focus for us. Will it switch to the portrait camera? Yep, okay. So you can see the fabric thread. So like in between, where is it? These 2 stitches here, you can see that there's 4 lines of fabric threads. So I've stitched over 2 on this. I used 2 strands on basically an effective 12.5 count, right? Because 25 divided by 2 is 12.5. Typically, a count that large, you would want to do 3 strands on, but I just made the call. I liked it with the coverage. I liked the coverage at 2 strands, so that's what I did. I have some other ones behind me. I can show you different types of Aida. This one is an 18 count Aida. I used 2 strands on it, and again we'll have it zoom in for us. So again, you can see Aida is just those boxes with the very large holes, and you just stitch right over just basically one fabric strand, or 1 fabric thread is what we call it. So this was stitched 2 over 1 because it's an Aida, and I used 2 strands of floss over one fabric thread, basically. Even though there's multiple little threads in here, we call it one because it's one giant chunk, right? Let's see. This is a good example. I'll take this one down. This is a 28 count. This was a pre-gridded cotton even weave from Zweigart. And the pre-gridding I'm not a fan of. It's really hard to get out. So just as a, hey, this is a thing, it's a bit difficult to get the gridding out of these. So since this was 28 count, I stitched over 2 for effective 14 count, because, you know, 28 divided by 2 would be 14. And I'll show you up close here. So we can see that I used 2 strands of floss over 2 fabric threads. So that's 28 count. You can also get these types of fabrics in like hand dyed. For example, this one from My Vintage Needle Arts. This one is a 32 count. And you can see where I frogged there, sorry. This one's a 32 count. So I'm using 2 strands over 2 fabric threads. And I'll get into like a little demonstration here in a little bit. I'm just trying to show you lots of different options. There's also this even weave that I have, which has a lot more of an open weave. If we look closely, you can actually see the rest of the stitching through this because of the open weave. So I'll zoom in on this one and you can see the difference. So this is just a very, very open weave. And some fabrics are like this. But I've stitched over 2 on this 28 count for effective 14. 2 threads. Hold on. It's okay. My 4-year-old just ran into my scroll frame and knocked it off. Yeah, so that's that. Now I'll show you some linens. This first one is a piece of linen that I got from Michael's, and I tea-dyed it myself. Like I said, linen is flax, so the fibers are definitely a lot different than, say, an Evenweave or Aida, because Aida is typically made of cotton, right? And so is like a Evenweave lugana. So the texture is a lot different. It tends to be a little crunchier, and it holds on to like the where you hoop it. So linen is a little less forgiving. It warps more easily, but it's a lot of fun to stitch on because the texture of it, you can just see the texture is so phenomenal. So I'll show you this up close. This is a piece of 28 count linen, and I have stitched 2 strands of floss over 2 fabric threads as well. And this is a pretty open weave for a linen. Some linens are tighter, some linens are looser. So that's that one. Before I show you the piece of fabric that I'm going to be demonstrating on, I'm gonna just go over the different sizes and what their equivalent is. So for example, you have 25, right? We talked about that being 12.5 already if you stitch over 2. And it's really easy, you just divide it in half. So if you wanted to try, let's say for example, the next one, we want to try stitching over 2 on an even weave, this would be my recommendation of where to start, because it's very easy to see what you're doing. But the next step up would be 28 count, right? Because that would equal 14. The next step up would be 32, which would equal 16 count. 36 count, which would equal 18 count. And the one I'm going to show you guys is a 40 count, which actually equals 20 if we're stitching over 2. And they go all the way up to, I've seen 56, I've seen 60. It gets crazy. So you just have to try and see what you like. I think probably my favorite for stitching over 2 is this one. This 32 count. It's just small enough so that it doesn't give like an overly pixelated effect from afar, but it's also not so small that you have to use one strand. Because remember, in this range, you're looking at one strand. 18 count with 2 strands is kind of thick. So this is kind of wishy-washy. But 32 count for me is just the sweet spot. So if you were looking to try stitching over 2, my recommendation would be to get just a cheap piece of 25 count lugana. Not pre-gridded or anything, just get one of these small cuts from, say, Michael's. And then try your hand at a small pattern. Max Pigeon's designs at Pigeon Coop Designs are perfect for trying this out because they're kind of bite-sized and they don't take super long. And I'll be completely honest, they're flippin' gorgeous. So you can't really go wrong. One of these will probably take you less than a month. And you can try your hand at stitching over 2. It's a whole lot of fun. And the end result is much smoother than, say, an Ada because the holes just don't pop out and, slap you in the face. So that's my thoughts on the differences between all of these and the size comparisons. I think there was something else I wanted to say. I can't remember what it was. Let me pull up my notes here. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about the difference between linens and Evenweaves, like the cotton ones. Evenweave fabrics are just what the name implies. They are very even strands of fabric threads woven together so that there's a very consistent box size across the whole piece of fabric. Now, linens are slightly different because they have what are called slubs sometimes, where you can see it's creating the texture in this fabric, these thicker horizontal and vertical lines. So when you're stitching over these, you have to be a little bit careful because you want to make sure you go through the hole, not through the slub, right? So that's one of the downsides of, say, working on a linen, but it's also kind of an upside because the fabric is just more visually appealing. But if you're looking for like a consistent thread count, and you want a nice, smooth, solid background, Evenweave is definitely the way to go. Evenweave also tends to take up dye more consistently than, say, a linen. Like, for example, I tea-dyed this naturally, and the bigger slubs didn't take up as much of the dye, so they're lighter. So that's something to keep in mind too if you're going to be dyeing your own fabrics. Linens are also a lot more expensive than Evenweaves, just because it's a much more difficult fabric to spin into threads. So you'll typically pay probably 33% more for a cut of linen than a cut of Evenweave, depending on where the dyer is sourcing it from. Cheaper Evenweaves and cheaper linens also tend to be looser because there's less fabric that they used, like less, how do I say this? Thinner strands used to create the weave, right? So that's less product overall. As far as stitching on these two different types of fabric, it's going to really depend on your personal preference, I think, because there's something in each type for everyone. If you really like to take the guesswork out of stitching and you want to be able to just, boom, see where your holes are, Evenweave is probably your better bet. You're not going to be fighting with slubs. You're not going to be fighting with the crinkly texture and trying to get wrinkles out of it. Evenweaves are a lot smoother and softer and have better drape to them. So if that's a consideration, you may want to think about that. But that's some very quick differences between the two of these. Really, to experience them, you have to get your hands on them and stitch on them. So again, my recommendation would be to get a cheap cut of a linen, a cheap cut of an Evenweave, and try your hand at it and see if you like it. Because if you like one of these significantly more than Ada, it's worth you buying a better piece of fabric, better quality to stitch on afterwards. But if you grab one of these, and a lot of the glaring, I'd say, cons of even these cheap pieces of fabric are similar on a more expensive piece of fabric. So you're gonna get acquainted with those kind of nuances that the fabric offers. So that's that. I'm gonna go ahead and get my 40 count linen on my scroll frame set up, and I'll show you how to actually stitch over two on these types of fabrics. It's the same process on Evenweave and on linen. The same concept, just with a little bit more technical difficulty working around slubs on linen. So I'll go ahead and get that set up. I'll do a little time lapse of me getting it set up in my setup. That's a lot of time saying setup. I have to readjust everything here. Clearance. Bring you guys down a little bit. And we will zoom in on the slip space here. That didn't nearly as long as I thought it would, so that's good. And the quality is not great, so let's see if we can fix that. Alright, so I've zoomed in here as far as I possibly can, and I'm going to try to keep it from bouncing around, but I want to make sure you guys can actually see the fabric threads up close. So I'm zoomed in 5 times with my iPhone, and it doesn't look terrible, so we're going to go with it. This is one strand of DMC 939, and we're zoomed in so close that it actually looks really fuzzy. So if that says anything, this is really tiny. So I've done some full crosses here. There's 3 here, and then the rest are half crosses because I was planning on coming back and doing these. But what we're gonna do is I'm going to finish this cross, and then I'm gonna jump over and just do an example stitch. So you can see that we're working over 2 strands of the fabric within these crosses. Okay, so I'll use my needle to try to point this out for you. So if we look at this cross right here, this is the bottom left corner of this cross. There's a hole in between the bottom legs, or the bottom of the cross. And then this one is over here. So we have a total of, for example, if we came over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 holes that we're working with for a single cross. And I'll use my needle to kind of cross it here so you can see. So each cross on 40 count with 1 strand is going to cover a total of 9 holes, with 2 fabric threads running down the center of the stitch from the top to the bottom and the right to the left. So I'll just pop over here and we'll go down along this line, and we're going to do a cross. So if I was counting down, say for example I had to put one over and 1 down from this one, I would count here, right? Because that would be the bottom leg of a cross, or the bottom of a cross diagonally left and down from this cross. And then we would go over 2 more small fabric holes, and we would do our stitch. Coming out here, we count over 1 hole, 2 holes. There's our bottom leg of our cross. We come back in the top left, you can't really see it, the top left hole of that cross, and then you're not gonna be able to see for a second. And then we're gonna be going in right here. So that's how you do a full crossover too, on say linen, for example. So I'm going to undo this, and then I'll show you how we would do some of the fractional stitches like are in this sampler that I designed. Right. So let's say, for example, in that very same spot, and I'm going to move this over so we can actually see it better because you guys are kind of off to the right-hand side. So if it's in that same spot, let's say we have, and I'll pop a picture up on the screen. Let's say we have a 3/4 stitch that's in the upper left, right? We're going to come and we're going to do the 1/4 stitch first. So top left to the center of the stitch, not to the opposite end, right? So that's our 1/4 stitch. And then we're going to come back and cross it like we would normally do our top leg. Okay, so that's a 3/4 stitch, and these are the stitches that I use for fractional stitches in all of my patterns. Okay, now let's say, for example, you wanted to do a 3/4 stitch that's in the upper right corner of the cross.
Nice.
We would do the 1/4 stitch first from the top left to the center, or the top right, excuse me, to the center. And then we finish off the 3/4 stitch by doing the top leg that goes in the direction that it's supposed to be on the pattern, right? So if your symbol is in the top right, you would make it this way. And this can be a little confusing sometimes because people tend to think they need to do their crosses all the same way. Yes, for full crosses, that is correct. However, when you're doing 3/4, things get a little bit different. So now let's do a 3/4 stitch in the bottom right corner of your cross. So bottom right to center, if I can get it to go through there. Here's the slubs being a little bit difficult, right? Because this strand, this fabric strand that goes across is a lot thicker. So we're kind of having to work around that. So there's our 1/4. And then we finish up the 3/4 with our top leg. Okay. Finally, we have 3/4 stitch in the bottom left of the square. Again, 1/4 stitch to the center of the square. And then top leg. Sorry, my kiddos needed something. And finishing this stitch just like the ones before. We're just doing the top leg. So that actually created quite an interesting little thing going on here. So that's 3/4 stitches in 4 consecutive boxes, all pointed away from each other. And you can see this would be the corner of the rest of those crosses should we finish them. So that's how you do 3/4 stitches. There's also something in my pattern called petite stitches, and petite stitches are not as difficult as you think, okay? So let's put a full cross here just for comparison's sake. So that one over. And then below it, we're gonna go and we're gonna do 2 petite stitches on, let's say, a diagonal. So they're gonna be diagonally from each other. And I will pop a chart on the screen of what I'm gonna do. Okay. So your petite stitches are all gonna be contained within a single cross stitch box. And they'll be positioned in the box such that it tells you where to do them. So let's say, for example, this stitch above here is empty. There's nothing here. And we need to do 2 diagonal petite stitches. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in the top right hand corner of what would be the bigger cross. We're going to go into the center of that bigger cross. And then we're just going to make a teeny tiny little cross. And you have to be careful on linen and Evenweave when you're doing this because the fabric threads go over and above each other. It's not like Aida. So you're going to have to make sure that your string doesn't slip under the slub. So that's one of our diagonals. We're going to come down here into the center of what would be the giant cross, right? And then go into the bottom left corner of what would be the giant cross. And then just cross it like a normal cross stitch. These are petite stitches. You can only really do petite stitches on an Evenweave fabric like this over 2 fabric threads. You would be very hard pressed to do this on Aida, unless you're working on like an 11 or a 9 count or something. I'm trying to think of what other stitches I can show you. Oh, squat stitch. Okay, so let's compare that to our other crosses. A squat stitch, and I'll show you the diagram up on the screen, is half of a full cross squashed into just half the box, okay? So the one above it is a full cross. A squat stitch would be into the center of the box, but not all the way across. So it's like intentionally making your stitch incorrectly, basically. So this would be a squat stitch in the left half of the box. You can also do squat stitches in the top or the bottom. So for example, again, we'll do a top of the box squat stitch. And you kind of just have to think about the fabric in a different way to do these. You're not thinking about it like you would Aida, right? It's not 4 holes for a single cross. It's 9 holes for different types of crosses and different types of stitches. I think one of the other things I wanted to cover was starting and finishing from the front on a linen or an even weave. Depending on how thick your weave is, you may or may not be able to do this. On a thicker weave, it's going to be easier because the fabric threads are going to hold your floss better. So I'll go ahead and I'll show you how I would say finish this thread. So let's come up here into this cross. What I do is I come up in the right hand side, and then it's going to be hard for me to show you without covering the screen, but I'm going to try. I come into the center of the box, so there should be a fabric hole here. So it should go through relatively easily. Yep. I come into the center of that box, sinking it under my top leg, right? Because when I do my stitches, I do the top leg bottom right to top left. So I've sunk it, and I'm going to sink it again in the center. And if you're feeling not so confident with that, you can always do it a second time or a third time. But every time you do it, you're going to end up with more threads underneath that top leg. And then what I do is I just go ahead and I snip it. I do top right to center, bottom left to center, pull up, snip. You can do the reverse of this to start your thread too. So let's come over here. Let's go over one here so we can start in the center of this neighboring stitch. You can pin stitch with 1 strand. Typically pin stitching with 2 strands is easier, but it can be done with 1 because as you can see in this up close, there are 2 smaller strands twisted around each other for this single strand of DMC pulled from 6, right? So let's go ahead and I'll show you how I do pin stitches with 1 strand. You have to be very cognizant of piercing the thread, and it's going to be really hard for you to see here, but I have gone through the thread just a little bit so that it holds itself in place, and I'm tugging on this.
It's snack time.
And then I'm going to complete the rest of my bottom leg. I got to pull this out of the way. And I have to pierce it again if I want it to stay. Okay, so we're piercing it as much as we can, you know, given how small it is. And I'm just gonna tug on this, and you can see that it's not going anywhere. And then we go ahead and we finish our cross over it. And we could go ahead and snip that, and it's not going anywhere. So those are some of the essential things that you need to know when you're stitching, first of all, over 2 fabric threads, and specifically for the pattern that I designed for this fabric. This fabric is also from my Vintage Needle Arts. As I said, it's a 40 count linen, and her fabrics are great. I highly recommend them. I haven't had a single piece of fabric that I was like, well, what the heck, what's up with this? So I highly recommend them. And we'll move on to the frequently asked questions in the next section here. Now for a few frequently asked questions about stitching on linen and Evenweave. This has taken a little while for me to actually sit down and film, so I apologize that this video has taken longer than I intended. But I have some questions from people on Instagram and Threads and the Discord that I'm part of. The first question is, can you start and end your thread with a pin stitch on a slub? And if you remember from previous parts of this video, slub is just a thicker line of the fabric thread. And the answer is yes. I mean, you can really start, you don't even have to do that, because the way I do the pin stitch, it's diagonal and it splits the thread. So even if you're working with one strand, it still splits the thread and anchors it in place. I've never had a pin stitch come out and I don't shove it into like a slub or a fabric strand anyway. But if you do want to do that, you can. If you're working with something like linen, I just be careful you don't like, physically disturb and rip the strand of fabric. That would be my only concern, especially on a larger number count, smaller fabric threads. Question number 2. Someone had asked about hand dyeing and the differences between the different fabrics. Really what it comes down to is the type of fiber rather than the weave. So for example, 100% cotton Aida is going to dye similarly to 100% cotton Evenweave, like a Linda or something, right? Once you start introducing other types of fibers like flax and rayon, for example, to the fiber is when it starts kind of going a little wonky, right? Linen especially will do this because the slubs that we talked about are very, very thick bundles of fabric fibers, and they tend to draw up dyes more slowly. So if you were to do a very quick dip dye, for example, the hand dyer that I buy my hand dyed linens and Evenweaves from, Teresa at My Vintage Needle Arts, she does a dip dye method, so it's quick, she dips it, she's done. But that also means that the slubs don't take up as much of the dye. So that can cause some like really cool texture, honestly. And I'll actually pull out this piece that I just got. This is a 25 count linen from her. So you'll be able to see what I'm talking about a little bit better. And you can see this is pretty see-through. This is a 25 count, but you can see that the slubs are quite a bit different than the rest of the fabric. You can really tell on the back. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're selecting your fabric for stitching on. All right, question number 3. Can you grid on Evenweave and linen? Yes, you can. I'll bring you back to this piece that I'm working on. This is S's for Strawberries by Little Dove Cross Stitch. And you can see that I've gridded on this. This is 25 count though, so just keep in mind that this worked over 2 strands of fabric. Equates to larger crosses than 14 count. So yes, this was fairly easy to grid on. So yes, you can. On Evenweave fabrics that are like a blend, it can be a little harder because the weave tends to be tighter. I'll show you this one. I've gridded on this one as well. This is a lugana from My Vintage Needle Arts. And I actually made a mistake on this one, so I had to rip out some stuff, and I went back in and I gridded so I can make sure I don't make that same mistake again. But you can see that I have done grid lines on here. So it's definitely possible. And I highly recommend it, especially if you're new. So I mentioned in the previous part of this video that I recommend 25 count stitching over 2. So just so you get the hang of it. Once you get the hang of it, you'll really get into a rhythm and you'll know where you need to put your needle for the next stitch, and you won't have to like look and see the 9x9 grid, and it'll just make more sense. To follow up on that a little bit more too, if you're worried about your lines coming out, or you're worried about just like the lines staying straight in general, you could always use something like a metallic floss and weave it in and out of a 10x10 grid. There are lots of tutorials on YouTube for that, so if you just search, like, I think a lot of people call it sulky. They use a sulky version of like a metallic thread, or like fishing line. A lot of people use fishing line for this too. Anything basically that you can't pierce with your needle. Because if you start gridding your fabric with like a stranded cotton, for example, each strand is actually 2 strands wound around each other. I don't know if you've ever looked closely at it, but for like DMC cotton, one of the 6 strands is actually technically 2 that you can't really separate. But your needle could pierce through it. So if you start stitching over your grid and you happen to pierce that, you're not going to be able to pull it out when you're done with the piece. So I've seen a lot of people get into trouble with that because they didn't realize that that would happen. So don't do that. Use like a metallic or a fishing line or something like that. Okay, question number 4. Describe the slippage of your floss under the fabric weave more. And this is really only a problem if your tension is really tight, or if you're trying to do 1/1 stitching on an even weave. In those cases, loosen your tension. Go back to like a hoop or something where you can control the fabric tension and you can kind of match it with your stitching tension. Or B, I'm trying to think, when you're stitching 1/1, it's really when you go to cross it that it tends to slip. So a way you can get around that is by doing the Danish method. So you can go all the way, like do all of your bottom legs all the way across first, and then come back and cross them, because then you won't have the counter pulling of making your X on the fabric threads, because up at the top here or at the bottom or right top down on either side, depending on how you make your cross, it doesn't matter. If at some point on the cross you'll have some kind of tension that causes slippage. So if you go this way first and then come back, you can avoid that entirely. And it's really hard to visualize, but you'll have to just sit down and try it and like watch what's happening. That's why I recommend the 25 count, because you can really see what's happening with the weave and you don't have to look super closely. So question number 5, the see-throughness of different fabrics. This really boils down to quality. And I hate that that's a thing, because this is a hobby and we don't want to spend tons and tons of money on it, right? But if you want something that's not super see-through, you're gonna have to spend a little more money on it. For example, I showed you beforehand, but I'll pull them out again just because for me it's been a couple weeks. Some 28 count Evenweave that I bought that was super cheap, and they were offering 50% off. And I understand why now. Usually when you get an Evenweave fabric that's 100% cotton, it doesn't look like this. This is very see-through, and this was very inexpensive. So sure, it works. Yes, this is what my bird stitch along's on. But I have to be careful with my fabric tension, my floss tension, because it'll take those fabric threads and squish them together and separate them from the other fabric threads. So I end up with like bowing, right? It's really weird. So spend a little more money on your fabric, especially if you're keeping it, you're not gifting it. if you're making something for yourself that you're going to hang on your wall and look at for the rest of your life, maybe pass down, spend that little bit of extra money. I'll show you a comparison to a lugana that I got from my vintage needle arts. This is also 28 count, so it's the same dropping stuff. It's the same size. But it's just, you can tell it's just so much denser. There is no seeing through this at all, right? So, big difference. And yes, this was probably 4 times as expensive. But there's a huge difference. So, spend the extra money if you can. If you can't, just know what you're getting yourself into. All right, did I have any more questions? Number 6. I was gonna look up a mnemonic on where to start on the fabric threads. Apparently there's like some tip on how to start on Evenweave so that you don't get slippage, but I have honestly never had an issue or had to think about it because I do Danish method, so I go across and then back. And my my floss stitching tension isn't crazy. So I know that there is a official recommendation on what to do, and I will pop it up on the screen here because I haven't looked it up yet because I forgot. But this image here will be showing you where to start with your stitches and how to look at the fabric threads to tell where you need to start. It has something to do with like starting on a post or something. I wish I could comment while I'm putting this on the screen, but I don't know what the answer is. So that's all of the questions that I got from people. If you have another question that I didn't cover, feel free to comment down below, and I will either reply in text form or I'll put up a short here on my YouTube channel and tag you in it so you can see it. I'm a very visual processor, so if I can't get it into words, I'll do a video for you. Yeah, but that's all I have on this topic, and hopefully it was helpful. If it was helpful, let me know. If you have ideas for other stitching tips and tricks that you haven't seen people cover, comment below. You can always DM me on Instagram if you have questions too about this video or about stitching in general. But yeah, that's me signing off. Bye guys.